In my career, just under 40 years, I've been through 5 major recessions, and this is the fifth one. This one is the most dynamic, but these are cycles, and real estate is cyclical, and economies are cyclical. And the US is the biggest, deepest market in the world. It's the best place to do our business. It's the best place to live. It's the best place to operate. And we go through these cycles. Frankly, it's about every 7 years, and we're in the middle of one. This one is a little bit more tenacious, but a lot of great things come out of these times. There's a lot of energy being released. And I think it's a pretty exciting time to be in the business. It's not for the faint of heart, but I think it's a pretty exciting time.
Welcome back to Connected Conversations. This is the second half of season 4, where we're trying to figure out what's going on in the world of commercial and corporate real estate. Today marks a milestone for us. This is an episode that we've been working towards, and I'm so thrilled to have with us today Tod Lickerman, who is the CEO of Cresa. Tod, how are you?
Hey, I'm great. Hey, thanks for having me today. I look forward to getting into one of my favorite topics.
Awesome. So this is a first for us. So you have to bear with me. I may be a little bit nervous. We've never had a CEO on the podcast, and I'm just really excited to hear your feedback on what is going on in the commercial real estate world in today's world. But before we get into that, as I've mentioned to you before, our guests love hearing people's background. So take us back as far as you want to. I don't care if you go to kindergarten and take us all the way up to present day. Give everybody a little bit of your background.
Well, sure. So I grew up in Chicago, right? Went to architecture school, graduated as an architect, worked for a year in the early 80s, and then went to work for a company called LaSalle Partners, which is one of the L's in JLL. I actually worked in our construction division. So I went from kind of designing buildings to wanting to build them and figure out how to put buildings together. The construction division was part of their development division as well. So I kind of worked my way up through construction to project management. I ended up running the project management business at LaSalle. I was the last partner inside LaSalle Partners in 1996. We went public in 1997. I was running the project management group. We built a national project management practice. It's called PDS, or Project and Development Services, over there now. But I sort of built that to a very big business doing design and construction management. I worked on the international integration of Jones Lang Wooten to create JLL. And so for 3 years, I flew around the world and helped create, 2 old partnerships into a big public company and worked on that. Came back and ran the facility management business. I ran a number of other high growth businesses, the energy business, the healthcare, the mobile engineering, a bunch of other things. And then I ran the corporate solutions business at JLL in the early teens, 2010 through 13, which is the outsourcing business. It's called, I think, Work Dynamics now. 2013, I went to go be CEO of a company called DTZ. DTZ was owned by an Australian engineering company called UGL. And I was hired to carve that company out of its parent company. It was much like a Jones Lang Wooten. It was an international real estate company. We carved it out. We separated it from the engineering company. We took it private. We sold it to a consortium led by TPG and Ontario Teachers Pension Plan. We sold it for $1.1 billion in 2014. We bought Cassidy Turley in the United States for $900 million in 2014. A couple other smaller acquisitions, and then we bought Cushman & Wakefield in 2015. So we kind of combined those companies to create the assets that are together that are Cushman & Wakefield now. Did a big integration, kind of finished building that platform. Each one of those companies got to be a place where they were a full-fledged global player. And then we were getting ready to go public, and I retired. So I took 3 years off, went and lived in France for a few years, for not quite a year, and just did fun things on the board of a number of different companies. one of which is Cresa, right? And so I always liked Cresa because it's a tenant rep only focused company. It's privately held. It's focused in North America. Was on the board, and then in 2021, I dropped in to be CEO of Cresa. So I've been here since then, and that's the story in a nutshell.
So I'm going to ask you a very basic question that I hope you don't find as an ignorant question. How does somebody become a CEO? Like, at what point are you ready to carry that title? And when did you know you were ready to carry that title?
Gosh, I don't know. I think you work backwards from it, right? I don't know that you start out saying that's a job I want to have. Maybe people do. I think it's a byproduct of leading things. The question is probably more is how do you end up in a leadership position? And the formula for me it's been very inadvertent. What has been very overt for me has been I've always wanted to learn more about the building life cycle. How to design and build buildings, how to maintain them, how to finance them, how to own, lease. What's the entire life cycle around buildings? And I just sort of got myself into bigger firms and learned more and more of different areas. Hey, I know about this. Now, how do I know about that? Okay, I know about this. How do I learn that? And then along the way, you learn how to create companies and how to grow companies and how to finance companies. And so it's always something building. It's learning about the real estate ecosystems. I think you have to pick a part of an industry that you like, an industry like I really like that industry. I want to go learn all about it. And then I'm going to enter into it. I'm going to work with the smartest people I can find. I'm going to keep learning and learning and learning and learning. And then pretty soon you find out that you know a few things and people ask you to be leader, or you see an opportunity and you say, you know what, that needs somebody to go help. And that's usually what it's been. Got in, learned something, and then you know what? This really needs to happen. Nobody's doing it. I'll raise my hand and do it. Yeah. And so you do that long enough, and pretty soon you know enough, and they ask you to do things like run the company.
It's building blocks, right? And I came to a point in my career where I became a really good salesperson, and the only way that I got there was by all the things I did before. I sat in a facilities department. I used the software that I sell today, the type of software that I sell today. I know how it's functionally implemented. So I became pretty good at speaking my clients and prospects language. And this is what I compel to the younger generation is you got to put all those pieces in place before you engage with your customers and prospects. You got to understand the world. And it sounds like that's the approach you took. You understood the built environment, lack of a better term, from the ground up, right? So if you take it from construction to build to maintenance to the acquisition portion of it to leasing that space out, eventually you got the full life cycle, right? In your career.
Yeah, you're just constantly learning. And I think what underpins it, just like your story, is you have to pick something that you're interested in and you find intellectually curious. And you're like, hey, I would want to spend a lot of my life learning about that. And so many times in my career, I've said, hey, I would love to go do that if anything ever comes up. And many times there hasn't been a job, and the job was created around a need, right? So like when LaSalle Partners merged with Jones Lang Wooten, I said, geez, I'd like to work internationally. Can I help on the integration of the firm? Literally. And jobs were created, not just for me, but they needed people to do that. I had my hand up. They knew I wanted to do it. People connected, and then you go.
That's kind of what I have a title. Nobody ever knows what I do. I'm the vice president of industry solutions. And they're like, what does that mean? And it's like, well, I raise my hand and help wherever I'm needed to help, where my expertise can come into play, which is, again, not at the same level as you, but it's certainly something that I do in my career and have thrived in my career. And one of the things that I think we share in common, I love buildings. I love buildings. I sit on my balcony. I just look at the Denver skyline and I pick out my favorites and I try to see which floors are occupied or empty. So as you've gone through your career, what are some of the favorite things that you have taken away from the commercial real estate, the built environment? What are some of your favorite things?
Yeah, I love cities. I love cities. Cities are vibrant, right? Just like if we to just keep going, what we're talking about, we could do this all day probably. I love cities, right? And when I was coming out of school, so I came out of college in 1985, quite some time ago, people were just starting to move back into cities. The vibrancy that you see in every American city today was just a glimmer back then. People lived in suburbs, you had the malls, you had the trains, you may go downtown to work, but you got out of there. In the United States, it was like that. Now in Europe, it's always been the integrated city, right? It's always been the residential integrated work city. And I've really loved watching the US develop really wonderful, deep cities, people-oriented, talent-oriented cities. Look at New York, right? New York, way back when, was not a place anybody would say, "Yeah, let me go live downtown."
I grew up in New York.
Yeah. How about Brooklyn? Go back 30 years ago and say, "Yeah, I'm going to live in. I wish I owned something in Brooklyn." If somebody said that to you 40 years ago, no way, right? So the thing I love about cities is there's a fabric and a vibrancy and a density to them. And when I retired, I went and lived in Paris, like I mentioned. I love that city. And the reason I love it is because it's residential, it's working. You go out your door, your apartment is your bedroom, basically. Your living room is the city.
Yeah.
And you live in the city, and you got your butcher and your baker and your restaurant and your everything. And you're living in one of the greatest cities in the world. I love the way that works. Now, buildings are a big part of that, right? Buildings are a huge part of the fabric of cities. In commercial, what we do, a lot of it's industrial or it's office. Probably our business is probably 60% office. It's about convening the workforce and supporting the workforce. You spend a lot of your life doing work, most of your life probably doing work. And you probably spend a lot of it at a place, changing a little bit now, and you're spending it with other people. So convening the workforce to drive productivity and to drive the means of production that is the ultimate core need that the rest of the industry rotates around, is people having a core need. It's either housing or it's retail or it's work. So you come together to do work. That commitment, that cash flow, the credit, and the commitment of the tenant is what drives the entire commercial real estate industry. And that's also why I focus on what we focus on, which is tenant representation at Cresa.
You reminded me of a term that I never understood as a little kid, the term bedroom communities, because I lived on a commuter line, like the train ran through all our towns and people would get on those trains. You'd hear about your friends. My dad was a blue collar guy, so he didn't commute to New York City. Yeah. But you would hear about my friends. Oh, he gets on the train every morning, goes to New York City. You're like, wow, but that's a bedroom. My town was a bedroom community.
Bedroom community.
There, but you go to New York to work, right? That's the idea.
Well, and we're going to get to this, but that's one of in the United States, we disaggregated, we blew up the typical city. Why? Because we had tons of space and we had cars and we love cars, right? So this idea that we blow up a city because there's tons of room, you drive out, you take all the retail out of the city or the neighborhood, and you put it at the mall, you drive there, you drive in, you drive to work. You have big houses, lots of greenery, those things that we loved in the suburbia, of America. But it became this really disaggregated thing. Living was here, retail was over there, work was way out there. And one of the challenges you have is it's not as integrated, it's not as exciting, it's not as lively, and you spend a heck of a lot of time getting places, especially as things get more and more crowded. So you now have these cities that are overloaded. Commutes are tremendous. And that's wasted time. I think commuting is a real waste of time. And I think a lot of the resistance in going back to work has to do with the inability for people to afford commute time. Why do I say afford? I mean, I can't trade off 3 hours of my productivity to go to and from someplace to be able to do what I could do right here. And so
gas prices, and then your impact on the environment, right? Carbon footprints and what that really does, especially with all these ESG requirements that are now mandated. You're having an impact on the world around you just by your commute. And the longer the commute, the bigger the impact.
Well, you make a good point. So we believe at Cresa that total footprint, the carbon footprint of your office space is not just the square foot of your office space. It's also what it takes to get to and from your office space. And your carbon footprint is bigger in many cases getting to and from than it is using the actual space. So when we do a new assignment, we benchmark the carbon footprint of your existing location based on where people live and how much they spend and burn to get there. That's a really good proxy for good planning, because with the pandemic, it used to be just assumed you had to commute and work didn't start till you got there. And give me 8 or 10 hours, and it starts from when you're here till when you leave, right? And the veteran community, you come down, you get to work at 8:30 and you don't leave till 6:30, and that's your job. That's not what today's like, right? That's not what today's like. Much higher productivity, much better connectivity, but that time in commute has a high carbon cost to it. It has a high social cost to it, and layer in the cost of housing, right? A lot of people are further away because of housing costs, right? For that job, for me to make a living at that job, I can only afford this much in housing, which means it may not be right downtown. It may be further out, quality of life. So I go out there for my quality of life. I got to commute.
Insane commutes. We had a guy when I first started working, he was commuting to New York City from deep in Pennsylvania, like taking the Amtrak every day. And it was just like, but his it was a tough job market back then, and he needed a job, at the end of the day.
New York is notorious, right? You could live up in Connecticut and work downtown, hour and a half, right? And we go to Tokyo, right? Somebody 2 hours solid on the train. That's more the norm than it isn't. And people work long hours. So I'm a big fan of taking that into consideration, trying to destroy commute, because I think if you could destroy commute, productivity stays high, and you rebuild the fabric of cities.
Yeah. Well, I love it. I just recently moved back to Denver. I live in the heart of Denver, Colorado. The train station is right below my building. And everything you said just really resonated with me, where somebody looked in my refrigerator and like, your refrigerator is empty. I have a Whole Foods across the street. I go shopping when I need food, and I get fresh produce and fresh food and fruits right outside my door. And then I just went for breakfast, and I took a friend of mine, and the breakfast was like $8 because I come in there every day. And she's like, "Oh my God." I was like, "Yeah, the guys, we take care of one another." So it's what you just said really resonated with me, and it's kind of a twist that I did not expect us to go on, but it's certainly how I feel. I love coming from New York and some of the places I lived. I love Denver, Todd. I absolutely adore it here.
And you chose to live downtown, right? You didn't go out to Broomfield or Fort Collins. You live downtown. That's fantastic. Yeah.
I did. So with all that said, that was really unexpected. I just absolutely loved it, because I'm just in such a transitional point of my life where I'm just really enjoying being back here in the city. And I really appreciate what you had to say about that. But let's talk about kind of the theme we've been digging into with the last couple episodes. And you're the perfect person to give your commentary on this. And as I sit here on my balcony at night, I do notice a lot of the buildings sitting empty. I can see floors that don't even have furniture in it, Todd. And in the mornings, some days, I don't see a lot of people getting off the train that's right outside my window. So we know the utilization rates of these buildings are dropping significantly. We know interest rates are very high, and how the debt resets every so many years on commercial real estate properties. What's going on? What's going to happen? I'm not asking you. I'm not going to hold you to this. I'm not going to come back 2 years from now and say, but Todd said, what do you see going on in the market today, and what's going to change, and what do you think needs to change? And just take it anywhere you want to go, because I know you recently sat down with the folks at William Blair and did a fireside chat with their analysts. So just talk to us a little bit. We'll take it in any direction you want to go. What's going on with the commercial?
Yeah, so let's unpack it in a couple of different ways. Let's talk about industrial first. It's a little easier story. Then let's talk about office, right? the two real pillars of commercial. So industrial, we all know, right? E-commerce has had a massive effect on the way we buy goods and services. The US is the largest consumer market in the world by far. Twice Europe, almost nearly 3 times the size of China. So that US consumer market drives a lot. And we all know within the last 10 years, we just completely changed how we buy. Not only online versus in person, but online to one day, maybe 2 days, maybe same day. And that is such a profound, the supply chain had to get reconfigured to allow for same day. And what's happening in that, because retailers are like, you pick something up, you're like, oh, let me get that. You look at a store, I should get that. I'll take a picture, I'll go home and order it, right? So it gets delivered because I'll know it's there. And if it's going to take more than 2 days, I probably don't buy it, right? One day, okay. Today would be great, right? So the retailers know that, and they know that. So that they're solving for products to the last mile. So what does that mean? Distribution centers have to get closer to populations. We also know that they need to hold inventory. So they went from just in case or just in time, meaning I'll hold only what I need and order it when I need it, to I better hold a lot because I need to be able to ship. So the supply chain went from pretty lean, kind of far away, because I can handle a 1 week, maybe a 2 week shipping, to just in time to just in case, much bigger distribution centers, very close to populations. And that is a fundamental change in the footprint of distribution for the United States. You layer on that the international, kind of supply chain security issues. That's made the supply chain have to hold more here. We went through the pandemic, what it's like when things get choked off far away, right? China shuts down, factories shut down, ships are waiting, can't ship. The things you order, you're not sure when you're going to get. That's what that supply chain looks like when it catches a cold, right? So what everybody did in the US was, we're going to hold more. We're going to hold more in the supply chain, and we're going to get it closer to the city. So what you have is a real peak in industrial real estate. U.S. is the largest industrial real estate footprint, the second largest industrial real estate footprint in the world, the second largest manufacturer in the world still. And so rents are up, tons of new construction and distributions, and that's a real pillar of commercial real estate, right? So real distribution centers, warehouses went from kind of a sleepy, inexpensive thing to a core, really important, strategic, expensive thing. And there's a real ecosystem in commercial real estate to solve that. Goodness, that's all good.
Todd, you're not the first person to say that on the podcast. One of my dear friends is a broker with CBRE, and when I talk to her, she's like, "Industrial's carrying me right now, Bob." And there's certain markets. She's a big fan of the Phoenix, Arizona market for industrial, as well as Dallas. She does a lot in Dallas, and there's certain markets that are burgeoning on that front in terms of industrial, because obviously there's certain requirements where, and limitations where you could put an industrial facility, and certain areas lend themselves to that much better. Is that a correct statement?
Exactly right. Exactly right. Phoenix is doing great. Inland Empire outside of LA is doing great. Dallas, Northeast, any place within critical mass, half-day shipping to major populations, huge. And distribution centers are just a very, very big, important part of the real estate food cycle now, and the chain. So if you're head of real estate, you're thinking about that, right? And it's a really big deal. So industrial, a lot of work been redone. It's been very tight. It was 5% vacancy last year. It's 7% this year. We have 600 million square feet of new distributions coming online in the next kind of 14 months. So it's going to help. It went from being very constricted to now it's going to open up. There's going to be a little bit more availability. So that's good for occupiers. Some people took out a little bit too much space as occupiers. They're going to shed some of that. But we're going to get a little bit of breathing room from an occupier's point, from a company point of view. There are going to be a little bit more options. If you've been a head of real estate and you've been trying to solve for distribution centers, it's been very tight. You've had very little leverage. You've had less choice than you might want. That's going to open up a little bit. So that's a good thing. A little bit, but it's not overbuilt. It's a good asset class. And that's a good part of our business now. So let's just say U.S. industrial, pretty healthy. Check, right? Now let's talk about office.
Here we go.
There we go. Two things. Let's come at it from the investor point of view. And then after that, we'll come after it from the occupier point of view. And it's a bit of a perfect storm, right? So from an investor point of view, we had an asset bubble built by fundamentally cheap and unsustainable debt levels. We just did, right?
Pause you a second. I just watched a whole thing on Warren Buffett where he said, you guys are talking the same. I don't know if you saw the same thing I saw. Obviously, you know about this. Keep going. I was just telling Chris all about this. Keep going.
The same thing, though. I mean, we had very, very cheap money, 2% rates for a long time. We had virtually no inflation for 10 years, virtually none. And we had cheap money, and we had a lot of good ideas as a country. We did a lot of very, very interesting, innovative stuff, as a country of the world. So a lot of interesting businesses got started and businesses got disrupted and remade. But a lot of buildings got built because, debt, you could put debt on a building, You put so much equity, you use debt, and then you build it, right? And that's what developers love to do. And they built it based on a certain amount of demand in hand and a certain amount of demand expected. And buildings take a long time to design and to create. And by the time you design and create them, it might be 3 years from when you conceived it, and the world might be different. So it's a natural cycle of overbuilding that happens, right? Because people build for what they see today, but then it shows up in 3 years. And unless job growth is just linear, absolutely job and S&P growth is absolutely linear, that the supply and demand, there's always a mismatch. But when there's cheap capital, there's going to be a lot of supply. That's what happened. So that's part of what happened. But it also, and you mentioned this before, if you're an owner of buildings and you use debt, you probably did a 5-year term note, and rates were historically low 5 years ago, and all those come due, and it's one thing when your debt comes due and your interest is 3-4 times what it was before.
Yeah.
It's another thing when your debt comes due, your interest is 3 times, and your fundamentals have retreated. If your cash flow is retreated because you didn't get to lease up the building, maybe a tenant or two leaves, or maybe a tenant or two might leave, you just might not be able to afford the mortgage, right? Afford the debt. And so you have a real equity crunch going on now. And it's different in almost by building, but in general, any building that's used any kind of meaningful debt, like let's say above 25%, there's a bit of a crunch, and it may be a crunch that just becomes uncomfortable, or maybe a crunch where ownership changes, right? And so let's just go into that a little bit. What happens, right? What happens is if you and I own a house together and we have a mortgage and it's 70% loan to value, and then you wake up 5 years later and your cash flow supports a house that's worth maybe 2/3 as much, the bank is going to say, well, I can lend on that, but it's going to be less. I'm going to lend less based on your cash flow, which means you have to add equity. You have to recapitalize the building. You have to put more equity behind an asset that may not be performing. And that can be a challenge. Many buildings have many different layers of equity holders. And even if they wanted to put more equity in, many of them may not be able to. So sometimes you're frozen. So if you're an occupier and you're, let's say, head of real estate and you're doing a lease, here's how it shows up. It shows up that the landlord can't finance the TI. That's what happens. They say, well, I can give you a great rate, lots of concessions, but very little in tenant work letter.
It's what a tenant improvement is.
Tenant improvements, right? It's building's core and shell. You got to build the inside. Normally in a healthy market is, I'll give you a certain amount, you put in a certain amount, and you basically each paying about half of the total cost of the fit out, the technology. Well, so tenants are showing up saying, "Oh, don't mind the building. I'd like to move. Let's do it. Get a decent rate." But then what happens is, can the landlord show up and provide their part of the capital? Tenants generally don't want to put more capital into buildings they don't own. They're usually good for about half. Anything more than that, they're really now getting into the real estate business, and they wouldn't be leasing in the first place if they're doing that. And that's really the rub. That's what's going on in many of these things is just the asset bubble, and then the retreating fundamentals. And then you have this crunch of there's a problem right now, right? There's a problem in this window. So let's talk about fundamentals, right? Why is there less office space being used? One is the pandemic happened, and in a week, we adopted all the technology we already had, right? We've been talking about using all that technology forever. We've been talking about putting everything on the cloud, virtual meetings, not traveling, flexible work, getting rid of your files. You don't have to be face-to-face, virtual teaming. We've been talking about this for a long time. It had the tools, but never had to do it all at once. And within a week, we went boom, right? And what happened was your company survived and might have even thrived because the S&P rebounded tremendously. Stock market rebounded from that. It was a V-shaped recovery after when you get through the end of 2020, rebounded. Jobs rebounded, right? We went from the height of the peak. We're 7.5% above pre-pandemic knowledge worker job levels, above. So in the past, you've had jobless recoveries. Opposite here. This is a full job recovery, and we're still underemployed. Let's come back and talk about that later. But so now you come back to everybody's worked at home. Some people have relocated. They pulled up sticks and moved somewhere else. Why did they do that? Cost of housing, quality of life, or child or elder care, right? It happens when you're in a certain stage of your life, you take care of your parents. So first you raise your kids, then you take care of your parents.
I wasn't in the city anymore, Todd. I took care of my dad for 3 years, and I had to go to outside the city to do that. Carry on.
I did the same thing. I moved to a lifestyle city because, hey, why not? Why shouldn't I live where I want to live if I'm still as or more productive than I was before? So but it's not just a lifestyle only thing like, hey, I always wanted to live in Denver. It's usually driven by something pretty strong. And cost of housing and child and elder care is a very big deal. So that's retreated. So now you have a workforce that the footprint looks very different for some of it. And the knowledge worker, and the knowledge workers are who occupy space. Then you come back, guess what? Whistle blows, everything's great, come on back to work. Well, that worked in 2012 after the global financial crisis, but nobody had moved house then. And nobody, there wasn't a trade-off on commute. Now I've moved house. So here's what's happened. Roughly 20% of the workforce as of last year can be and is remote, just fundamentally remote. These are people that don't need to come in and don't come in every day at all. And it's about 20%. We're not talking about hybrid. We're not talking about dedicated. About a third of the work, about 35% of the workforce kind of should really be in the office. Their job is one that belongs in the office. About 40 to 50% of the workforce can and should be hybrid. And then about 15 to 20% of the workforce is remote. So what's happened was a year ago it was 20% was remote. Now it's about 15%. And I think that's kind of where it ends up is there's 15% of the workforce that is in a permanently remote kind of job. There are a lot of jobs for a lot of good reasons that just can and will be remote. And they were never coming back to any office. They live elsewhere. They're virtual. They make more sense. They're closer to lower cost housing. When we go out to hire a certain position, customer service rep is probably the easiest example. In our world, lease administration. Lease administration, people can live wherever they want, work remotely, do that work. It's great, right? Some kind of analytics you can do. Those are jobs that are permanently remote. They're not coming back. And so what happened was, and by the way, those permanently remote number before the pandemic was about 2.5%. So we went from 2.5% permanently remote to at least 15%. And so that demand is destroyed. It's gone away totally, right? So you have overbuilding over here. You have at least 15% of the demand has gone away for good. And then you have this in between, 45 to 50%. That's hybrid. What does that mean? Hybrid means there's reasons for me to be in the office, but it doesn't have to be every day. Now, here's what's happened. What's happened is that companies have found that the most effective thing is hybrid is fine as long as you're all in the same day. So we have a company, we can work 2, 3, 4 days a week, but those days we all got to be in. Why? Because otherwise there's no benefit to the interaction if your team isn't in. And that has to
be purposeful too.
Interaction, purposeful with the people that you work with. So my team has to be in. Law firms are notorious for this. We're in 4 days a week. We're in 3 days a week, and our whole team needs to be in. Okay. So as soon as you say hybrid works, but everybody's got to be there the same day, you're not really getting a ton of real estate savings because you have to still build for and house peak. Yep. You still have to house peak. So you can look at a weekly average that includes Mondays and Fridays, which are very low. You have to look at what the peak is. So let's say Wednesday is peak and it's whatever. That's what you're building for. The dedicated people, the hybrids, then that's the size. So the reality is, I think, and there isn't great data on this, but from what we can say, I think we've destroyed about 15% of the demand permanently. I think we've introduced half of the workforce can be hybrid, and that's a good thing. And I think the kind of space you need is different, right? We know when I come in and I don't need files and I don't need, what I need is a hookup and maybe a Zoom room and tons of meeting rooms. And then we're going to lunch and then we're meeting again. It's a very different kind of space. So what has to happen is a couple of things. We're shedding space and then we have to rework the space. So all the embedded, most of the installed base built before the pandemic needs some level of rework. And then you're going to
where are they getting the capital for that to do the rework on that space?
That's the crunch, right? That is the crunch. Now, if you own a building, it's your own capital, right? I own a building, I pay the TI to rent it. But the problem is that giving back space, if you own it, doesn't really matter, right? So I can tighten up in the own building, but unless I can sell part of the building, you don't bother as much. But if you lease a building, so hey, if I tightened up, I then am not paying a lease. I do a new lease and do it near the termination. That capital is something that companies don't want to fund 100%. They want to fund about half, which means the landlords need to fund the other half, which means the deals are getting done are the landlords that can fund the TI, that have come to terms with, in order to keep tenants, I got to put more money into the building. Not just because my lender is going to lend less, but also because I need to do it to refit out the tenant space. And by the way, the lease is going to be smaller. So it's a bit of a bitter pill for landlords, but that's what's going on.
What you just said, I always try to hone in on the point that I want to take away from. And what you said, nobody has said on my podcast, nor have I read anywhere somebody say that you have to build for peak utilization still. It doesn't matter if it's a shotgun blast of somebody dribs and drabs of people coming in. Maybe some people just want to get out of the house, right? But that's not purposeful and that's not peak. So if they go in on a Tuesday, you're not looking at that. What you're looking at is that Wednesday when you have 70%, 80% occupancy or utilization. So
let's build on that. That's true.
Nobody has said that to me.
But you talk to heads of real estate, you talk to people that are housing the workforce, that's what people are doing. Now, here's the challenge. That may be where we end up. The challenge is you still have to get everybody back in the groove of coming back. And so part of what you see is, hey, look, here's how much space we need, but I still don't get everybody in. Even all the hybrids, I don't get everybody in. And part of the challenge is you may need to split your footprint up, because where your talent is today, where they were yesterday, where they are today, and where they may be tomorrow may be very different. And so you may see more of a hub and spoke where companies have
the hub and spoke concepts that a lot of my friends have been talking. They have been talking about that.
you might do it, right? You might say, why would I going to pull everybody in downtown? What if I have this much here and that much there and that much there? Everybody's within 20 minutes. To me, the optimum is get me within a 20-minute commute and I'll do it. That's how you do. So when we start a new assignment, we talk to a client, we say, where's your talent today? And then we say, where's your talent tomorrow? We pick up the data, we pick up the labor data and we show it on a map. Where are those kind of jobs tomorrow? Where are those people living? Okay, people that do that work at that rate. And then you got to go there. You got to go within 20 minutes of that. If you do that, you're going to have a consistent labor force. If you don't, you're going to wonder why you can't fill your jobs.
I've got a question pop in my head. So if we move to this hub and spoke model, which most are, right? And you have this HQ, you have this beautiful HQ, and it's all these hundreds of thousands of square feet, and you have a spoke somewhere that's accounting for those people who have moved away. And either you own that building or the lease term's too long or it's not financially responsible to early terminate. What do you do with that additional space?
Yeah, it's available. It's excess. It's ghost space. It's excess vacancy.
Sublet?
You have, so the accounting rules say have a lot to do with it. So on your own, when you're running a company, as soon as you say, I no longer use that space, you write it off.
Okay.
So that happens. And then you do your best to sublease it, right? You do your best to sublease it. So companies are very careful when they take impairments because it hurts earnings. It's a write-off. But if you fundamentally have that thing that you don't need anymore, GAAP will tell you, you write it off, it comes off your P&L, but you take a one-time hit on that. And if you own it, it's the book value. If you lease it, it's the rest of the term. That's a loss you're going to take. So I was going to say you've realized a loss. Go ahead and put it through. So what you find is that real estate terms are long. Whether you own a building and it lasts for 40 years or you do a 10-year lease, they are long. Your actual need within that period is going to change. And so this idea that what you have and what you need doesn't fit, to be honest, is more the norm than it is the exception. So big companies are always understand that they have the supply that they have and have committed to is different than their need. And they're always looking for ways to optimize.
Well, Todd, honestly, you gave me some nuggets that I haven't heard yet in all my conversations. I really love the point about building towards utilization, occupying towards peak utilization. And then all the stuff you said about cities and really personally, that kind of meant a lot to me at the time. Love the commentary on industrial. But what I like to do is we come to time here and I wrap things up. I show a little bit of gratitude towards my guests. And what I want to say to you is I'm unbelievably honored that somebody who has had a career like yours and has gone through everything you've gone through and briefly retired and came back to run a company like Cresa that I've admired for a long time because I love your approach where you only focus on the occupier. I want to say thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to sit down with me and educate not just me, but our audience. My audience is going to love this because at the end of the day, somebody like you, your voice is what we need in a time like this. And I think there's a lot of preconceived notions, much like I have. It's like, what are we going to do with all this space? You gave us a ton of nuggets that really helped me clarify kind of what's going on in today's commercial real estate market. And this is the last thing. Any final thoughts, any hot takes? One last take before we get out of here.
So look, as I look back in my career, just under 40 years, I've been through 5 major recessions, and this is the 5th one. This one is the most dynamic, but these are cycles, and real estate is cyclical. And economies are cyclical. And the US is the biggest, deepest market in the world. It's the best place to do our business. It's the best place to live. It's the best place to operate. And we go through these cycles. Frankly, it's about every 7 years, and we're in the middle of one. This one is a little bit more tenacious, but a lot of great things come out of these times. There's a lot of energy being released. And I think it's a pretty exciting time to be in the business. It's not for the faint of heart, but I think it's a pretty exciting time.
Your advice to my audience is stay the course. Stay the
Stay the
course.
course. It's an exciting time to be in the business. Frankly, there's never kind of been a better time where there's been more going on than right now all at once. It'd be nice if it stabilized a little bit, but it's a pretty exciting time.
And with that, that's one of the best takes we had. That's a great way to wrap up the podcast. Thank you so much, Tod. This was amazing. So with that said, that's Tod Lickerman, CEO of Cresa. I'm Bob Mostachetti from Nuvolo. I'll see you on the interwebs.
Great. Thanks for having me.